spooky and ASMR. Hello, my spooky friends, and welcome back, or welcome to my channel. I am so happy to see you today, as today I have another true crime ASMR video for you to enjoy. Today we will be diving in to probably one of the most famous serial killers. He is very well known, and let's get into it. Today we will be talking about the case of Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Bundy was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of young women and girls during the 1970s. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 murders. The total number of his victims is likely to be higher. Bundy's modus operandi typically consisted of simulating that he had an impairment of some kind. This was to convince his target that he needed their help, and this way he duped her into believing he was an authority figure. He would then lure his victim to a vehicle parked in a more secluded area, at which point he would bludgeon the woman unconscious. He would then restrain them with handcuffs before driving his victim to a remote location to be sexually assaulted and killed. Bundy would frequently revisit the bodies of his victims, grooming and performing sex acts on the corpses until decomposition and destruction by wild animals made further interactions impossible. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping their severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, Bundy broke into homes at night and bludgeoned, maimed, strangled, and sexually assaulted his victims in their sleep. So, I would like to state now that if any of the subject matter mentioned is triggering for you, this whole video is going to be containing and is about this content. So if this is something that bothers you, triggers you, I have a bunch of other videos that would be more suitable. So as such, viewer discretion is advised. I will be adding this case to my true crime ASMR series playlist, and this is where you can find past and future videos in this series. Today's video will be a mix of soft speaking and whispering. We are going to be going back to trading off weeks of the format in which these videos will be delivered. So, between soft speaking and whisper. So, let's get into it. Ted Bundy was born on November 24th, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. His biological father's identity has never been confirmed. His original birth certificate apparently assigns paternity to a salesman and U.S. Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though a copy of it listed his father as unknown. Louise claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant. Census records reveal that several men by the name of John Worthington and Lloyd Marshall lived near Louise when Bundy was conceived. Some family members expressed suspicions that Bundy was sired by Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell. However, in 2020, a psychiatrist, Dorothy Lewis, claimed she received a sample of Bundy's blood and that a DNA test had confirmed that he was not a product of incest. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Roxborough neighborhood of Philadelphia. He lived with his maternal grandparents, Sam Cowell and Eleanor Longstreet. The couple raised him as their son to avoid social stigma that came with being born out of wedlock at the time. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. Bundy would eventually discover the truth about his family, and although his recollections of the circumstances varied, he told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard. But he told biographers Stephen McCod and Hugh Ainsworth that he had found the certificate himself. Biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who knew Bundy personally, wrote that he did not find out about his true, who his parents were, until 1969, when he located his original birth record in Vermont. Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment toward his mother for never telling him about his real father and for leaving him to discover the truth about his paternity himself. Bundy, as many do, exhibited disturbing behavior at an early age. Louise's younger sister, Julia Cowell, recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, and her 3-year-old nephew standing by the bed, smiling. In some interviews, Bundy would speak very highly of his grandparents and said that he identified with, respected, and clung to his grandfather, Samuel. In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel was a very mean man. They stated he beat his wife, dog, swung neighborhood cats by their tails, expressed racist and xenophobic attitudes. In one instance, Samuel reportedly threw Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He would sometimes speak aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. Bundy would describe his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically went through electroconvulsive therapy for depression and feared to leave their house toward the end of her life. These descriptions of Bundy's grandparents have been questioned in more recent investigations. Some locals in Roxborough remembered Samuel as a fine man and expressed being very confused and surprised at the reports of him being violent. The characterization that Sam was a raging alcoholic and animal abuser was a convenient characterization used to make people justify why Ted was the way he was, said one of Bundy's own cousins. He then would go on to state, "From my limited exposure to him, nothing could be farther from the truth. His daughters loved him dearly and had nothing but fond memories of him. In addition, Louise's sister, Audrey, stated that their mother could not leave her home because she suffered a stroke due to being overweight and was not mentally ill." In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, left Philadelphia with Ted to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy. He was a hospital cook at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny formally adopted Ted. John and Louise conceived 4 children together, and though John tried to include his adopted son in camping trips and other family activities, Bundy remained distant from him. Bundy would later complain to a girlfriend that Johnny was not his real father, wasn't very bright, and did not make much money. Which is very... Could you imagine? This man didn't have to adopt you, and you're like upset about it. Could you imagine? Anyway, Bundy, as always, had varied his recollections of Tacoma in later years. To McCod and Ainsworth, he described roaming his neighborhood, picking through trash bins in search of pictures of naked women. To attorney and author Polly Nelson, he said that he perused detective magazines and crime novels for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or abused women. In a letter, he asserted that he never ever read fact detective magazines and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. He once also said that he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else could be seen. Psychologist Al Carlisle claimed that Bundy started fantasizing about women he saw while window peeping or elsewhere and mimicking the accents of some politicians he listened to on the radio. In essence, he was fantasizing about being someone else, someone important. Bundy's childhood Tacoma neighbor, Sandy Holt, described him as a bully and a really mean-spirited kid, saying that he liked to scare people, he liked to be in charge, he liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. She also alleged that Bundy engaged in animal cruelty. He hung one of the stray cats in the neighborhood from one of the clotheslines in the backyard, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it on fire, and she could hear the cat squealing. She claimed that Bundy would take younger children in the neighborhood into the woods and terrorize them. He'd take them out there, strip them down, take their clothes. You'd hear them screaming for blocks. She said, I mean, no matter where we were here, we could hear them screaming. Holt added that Bundy built makeshift punji traps around his neighborhood, injuring at least one girl. She went on to say one little girl went over the top of one of Ted's traps and got the whole side of her leg slit open with the sharpened point of the stick that she landed on. Accounts of Bundy's social life also varied. He told journalists McCall and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He also claimed to have no natural sense of how to develop friendships. He claimed, I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what underlay social interactions. Some people perceived me as being shy and introverted. He went on to say he didn't go to dances. He didn't go on the beer drinking outings. He was a pretty, you might call him straight, but not a social outcast in any way. Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School, however, told interviewers, I couldn't think of the word, but people from his school told interviewers that Bundy was well known and well liked there. He was a medium-sized fish in a large pond. His only significant athletic passion was downhill skiing, which he pursued enthusiastically with stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, Bundy was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft. At age 18, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington and many other states, which I think that's a good thing, but obviously, I don't know. In this case, I don't think it was a good thing. Anyway, we We'll now move on to the university years of Ted Bundy. Bundy would graduate in 1965 from high school and would attend the University of Puget Sound. He would attend there for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a UW classmate, Diane Edwards. Bundy later described Edwards as the only woman he ever really loved. In early 1968, Bundy dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. Edwards graduated in the spring of 1968. Edwards being Diane Edwards, Bundy's girlfriend at the time. She would leave Washington for San Francisco. Bundy would visit her later that year after he earned a scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford University that summer. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. Shortly after, Edwards ended the relationship with Bundy and returned home in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in Bundy's development. He was devastated by the breakup and traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia, and enrolling for 1 semester at Temple University. During his studies, he frequently visited New York City, where he was drawn to pornography. He would immerse himself in violent pornographic literature while nursing his wounds from the breakup with Diane. It was also at that time, in early '69, that it was believed that Bundy discovered his he found out the truth about his parents. Bundy returned to Washington in the fall of '69 when he met Elizabeth Klopfer, identified in Bundy literature as Meg Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall. She was a single mother from Ogden, Utah, and she worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. Their tumultuous relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in '76. Bundy became a father figure to Elizabeth's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old when he started dating her mother. He remained in Molly's life until she was 10, after he had been arrested. As an adult, Molly wrote of incidents beginning at age 7 in which Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate with her. Her accounts include Bundy hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her at risk of drowning, indecent exposure, and sexual touching disguised as accidents or games. In the mid-1970s, Bundy was now apparently focused and goal-oriented and re-enrolled at UW, this time as a psychology major, which I find this so funny when not all people, but it seems like a lot of people who need therapy and need psychological help go as psychology majors. Not all, but a lot. But anyway, we all could use some therapy. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. There, he met and worked alongside Ann Rule. She was a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Ann Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time. She described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. After Bundy graduated from UW in '72, he joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign, posing as a college student. He shadowed Evans's opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans' team. Evans subsequently appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis. He was the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. In early 1973, despite mediocre SAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors. Now, with what we know now, could you imagine being those professors? Like, I don't know. If that was my professor and I knew that they were the psychology professor of none other than Ted Bundy, and they gave him a letter of recommendation, I don't know. I would not want to be taught by you. Now, moving on. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of '73, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Diane Edwards. She marveled at his transformation into a serious and dedicated professional, seemingly on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. Bundy continued to date Klopfer as well. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy matriculated at UPS Law School and continued courting Edwards, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage. At one point, he introduced her to someone as his fiancée. In January of 1974, Bundy abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, she demanded to know why he had unexpectedly ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he would reply, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. Bundy later explained that he just wanted to prove to himself that he could have married Diane. But Diane concluded in retrospect that Ted's high-power courtship in the latter part of 73 had been deliberately planned, that he had waited all those years to be in a position of where he could make her fall in love with him so that he could drop her, reject her, as she had rejected him. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. Now, there is no consensus as to when or where Bundy began killing women. He told many different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. Bundy said that he attempted his first kidnapping in Ocean City, New Jersey in 1969, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philly in '69. Bundy hinted to homicide detective Robert Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in '72 and another murder in '73 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater, but he refused to elaborate. Both Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. Bundy's earliest documented homicides were committed in '74 when he was only 27 years old. By his own admission, he had by then mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. Now, with what we know about from his neighbors and things like that, homie was setting traps for people, okay? He definitely was killing people as a young kid. And that's probably where he got a taste of what he liked, I think, personally. Now, shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, around the time that he ended his relationship with Diane Edwards, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. She was a dancer and student at UW in Seattle's University District. After he bludgeoned Sparks with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries and rupturing her bladder. Sparks remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days, and although she survived, she was left with permanent brain damage with significant loss to her vision and hearing. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy. She was a UW undergraduate who broadcasted morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots, and carried her away. He later stated that he drove Healy to a secluded area where he raped and murdered her before dumping her body. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about one per month. On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, which was 60 miles from Seattle, she left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus, but never arrived. Bundy claimed that he burned Manson's skull in his girlfriend's fireplace down to the last ash in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness. On April 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, which was 110 miles from Seattle. 2 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier with a man wearing a sling who was asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks, aged 22, left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, which was 260 miles from Seattle. She left to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Bundy claimed that he spotted Parks in the cafeteria and persuaded her to go with him to a bar. After they got into his car, he tied and gagged Parks and drove her back to Washington to be killed, raping her twice on the way. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, who was 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien near Seattle Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. Bundy later stated he brought Ball back to his residence where they had a consensual sexual encounter before he strangled her while she was sleeping. Although this failed to explain the damage that was done to her skull. Investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from similar appearance, young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. So, to me, a lot of people say these women kind of look like his mother, but to me, all these women look so much like Diane Edwards. Personally, I think it's just very kind of scary how much they look like Diane. Now, in the early hours of June 11th, 18-year-old UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. Bundy later told investigators that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles from Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. The next afternoon, he returned to the UW alley and, in the very midst of a very major crime scene investigation, located and gathered Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot and departed unobserved. This whole thing of him being able to leave unseen, it was astonishing to police, even today. Bundy said he revisited Hawkins's corpse on 3 occasions. After Hawkins's disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man on crutches with a lit cast and carrying a briefcase in an alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night of her disappearance. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, which was a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. During this time, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At the DES, he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone. She was a twice-divorced mother of 2 who would play an important role in the final phase of his life 6 years later. Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear was spreading. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure was piling on law enforcement, but the scarcity of physical evidence really just made it difficult. Police would not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, and were within a week of midterms or finals. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared, and at many crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Washington and Oregon murders culminated on July 14th with the abductions in broad daylight of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. 4 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British. He introduced himself as Ted and asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 of them refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw Ted approach Janice Ann Ott. She was 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court. Ted approached her with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Nasland, who was 19, was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy told FBI agents that Ott was still alive when he returned with Nasland, and that he forced one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other. But he later denied it in an interview with another FBI agent on the eve of his execution. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Klopfer Rule, a DES employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect. But detectives were receiving up to 200 tips per day. They thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. On September 6th, 2 cruise hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Ott and Nasland near a service road in Issaquah, which was 2 miles east of the Lake Sammamish State Park. They were only 2 miles away. Could you imagine? An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked just east of Issaquah. Manson's remains were never recovered. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer, his girlfriend, in Seattle. While he called her often, he dated at least 12 other women. As he studied the first year law curriculum a second time, Bundy was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. He said it was a great disappointment to him. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September 2nd, Bundy raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse before disposing of the remains in a nearby river. On October 2nd, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Bundy confessed that Wilcox was walking on a poorly lit main roadway when he parked his car and forced her into an orchard. He then restrained her, put her into his vehicle, and drove back to his apartment, where he allegedly kept her for 24 hours. Bundy informed investigators that her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles away from Holiday, but they were never found. On October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, another Salt Lake City suburb, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor at around 9:30 p.m. Her nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Post-mortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31st, Laura Ann Aim, who was also 17, disappeared 25 miles south of Leahy after leaving a Halloween party by herself just after midnight. She was last seen trying to hitchhike. Her naked body was found by hikers 9 miles to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. The medical examiner estimated that she had died on November 20th, 20 days after her disappearance. Both Smith and Aim had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Aim and Smith, including hair shampooing and applying makeup. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy would approach 18-year-old telephone operator Carol DeRanch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, which was less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Smith was last seen. He would claim to be Officer Rosland of the Murray Police Department and told DeRanch that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint when DeRanch pointed out that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station. He immediately pulled onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and DeRanch was able to open the car door and escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, who was 17 and a student at Viewmont High School, disappeared after leaving a theater production at the school to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and a student told police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to ID a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from DeRanch's wrists. Bundy eventually admitted to abducting Kent and keeping her at his apartment for a day, stating she was alive during half of it. In November, Klopfer called King County Police the second time after reading that young women were disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. Detective Randy Hergeshmeyer of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, but the Lake Sammamish witness considered most reliable by detectives failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Klopfer called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at that time, no credible forensic evidence linked him to the Utah murders. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Klopfer, who did not tell him that she had reported him to police on 3 occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn. This was in Snowmass Village, which was 400 miles from Salt Lake City. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. According to the coroner's report, she had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear grooved depressions on her skull. Her assailant had slit her left earlobe, and her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March 15th, 100 miles north of Snowmass Village, Vail ski instructor Julie Lyle Cunningham, who was 26 years old, she disappeared while walking home from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her before sexually assaulting her at a secondary site near Rifle, which was 90 miles west of Vail. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Oliverson, who was 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6th while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. Bundy stated he abducted Oliverson, killed her in his car near the Utah state line, and dumped her body in the Colorado River. This admission was supported by gas receipts, which showed that he was in the city on the same day that Oliverson went missing. On May 6th, Bundy parked outside of the Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, which was 160 miles north of Salt Lake City. And after seeing 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver walking along by herself, he lured her into his vehicle before driving her to his Holiday Inn hotel room. He then raped Culver and drowned her in the bathtub. He disposed of her body in the Snake River north of Pocatello. Bundy reportedly provided intimate details about Lynette's personal life in his confession. In midday, 3 of Bundy's Washington State DES co-workers, including Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. He subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Klopfer in early June, and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Klopfer made no mention to Bundy of her multiple discussions with authorities in King County and Salt Lake County. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student, known as either Kim Andrews or Sharon Ower. On June 28th, 15-year-old Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, which was 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her murder became Bundy's last confession, tape-recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver, and Curtis were never recovered. In August 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as it is known, the LDS Church. And this is all despite him not being an active participant in services and him ignoring most church restrictions. He would later be excommunicated by the LDS Church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked his religious preference after his arrest, Bundy answered Methodist, the religion of his childhood. In Washington State, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it had begun. In an effort to make sense of the overwhelming amount of information that they had, they resorted to what was back then an innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County payroll computer, which was huge and considered a primitive machine back then. And it was really the only computer that they had available to use. They would then put in many lists that they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and so on. They queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from Utah of his arrest. On August 16th, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol, and he was arrested by Bob Hayward in Granger, which is a suburb of Salt Lake City. Hayward observed Bundy cruising a residential area in his Volkswagen Beetle during the pre-dawn hours, and then fleeing at a high speed after seeing the patrol car. He noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats, and searched the car. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing. He had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 Durant kidnapping. He also remembered Bundy's name from Klopfer, Bundy's girlfriend's, phone call a month later. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Kent had disappeared. Police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Bundy, so he was released on his own recognizance. He later said that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Klopfer. She told them that in the year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Bundy was perpetually in debt, and Klopfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers, with a flashlight examining her body. He kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed for protection. He kept the lug wrench in there for her. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Klopfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of the existence of Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas of 1973. Now, I have such this love-hate relationship with Klopfer. She was with Bundy for so long, had him around her child, thought about marrying him. She had suspicions of what he was doing, called the authorities, and I feel bad that she got cheated on, but this man carried every single red flag that a man could possibly have. Every single one. So I don't understand, I don't know. And it's not like he offered her anything. He must have been phenomenal in the nighttime hours to her or something. He was, if I woke up and turned over to see my boyfriend under the covers examining my body, just take a second. As many times as I read this, that part always gets me. It's giving Buffalo Bill. He's looking at your skin for a suit. And to keep him around her daughter, I don't know. Anyway, in September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI techs went through it. They dismantled it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands that were microscopically indistinguishable from those of Smith and Durant. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy in a lineup, and Duranch immediately identified him as Officer Rosland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as a stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Kent, whose body had not yet been found. But more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the Duranch case. Bundy denied knowing Duranch, but had no alibi and was freed on $15,000 bail, which was paid by his parents. And he spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Klopfer's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. When Ted and I stepped out onto the porch to go somewhere Klopfer had wrote, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. And yet you're still with this man. You're housing him. In November, the three principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the killings. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the kidnapping of Duranch. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found Bundy guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, Bundy was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard, carrying an escape kit, which had road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card. He would then spend several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January of 1977. Now, one of the many things that Bundy is notorious for, it is for his escapes. So, on June 7th of 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney and as such was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guards' view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, Bundy limped through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, Bundy left the cabin and continued south toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days, he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, Bundy broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, taking food and a ski parka. However, instead of continuing south, he went back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of an Aspen golf course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Bundy drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Campbell's body. As his own attorney, Bundy had rights of discovery, indicating that his escape had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pretrial motions consistently resolved in his favor, and significant bits of evidence were ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal, and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors with as little as 1.5 years to serve on the Durange conviction, Had Ted just stayed put, he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period by visitors, Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, Bundy sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel reinforcing bars and his cell ceiling, having lost 35 pounds. He was able to wriggle through and explore the crawl space above in the weeks that followed. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a huge case in the small town of Aspen, and Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23rd, the Aspen trial judge granted his request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and non-violent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate a sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife. He then changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, which was 60 miles away. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already gone and in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was present in a local tavern on January 2nd. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove south to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida on the morning of January 8th. He stayed for one night at a hotel before renting a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. Bundy later said that he initially resolved to find legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing he could probably remain free. and undetected in Florida indefinitely, as long as he did not attract the attention of police. But his one job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce ID. He reverted to his old habits of shoplifting, stealing money and credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping carts at local grocery stores. In the early hours of January 15th, 1978, 1 week after his arrival in Tallahassee, Bundy entered FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m., he hit Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, aged 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept. He then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Janet Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples off, bit deeply into her left buttock, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, who was 21, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder. And Karen Chandler, who was also 21, suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the attack. Kleiner attributed their survival to automobile headlights illuminating the interior of their room, which scared Bundy. Tallahassee detectives determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked 21-year-old FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness in her left ear and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On Thomas's bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic. On February 8th, Bundy drove 150 miles to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives. He identified himself as Richard Burton from the fire department, but retreated when Parmenter's older brother arrived and confronted him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sammamish River State Park. This was 35 miles northwest of Lake City. Forensic experts surmised that Leach had been raped before having her throat cut and her genitals mutilated with a knife. On February 12th, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. What is with this guy and the Volkswagen Beetles? When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The 2 struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. Also found were a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton from the fire department in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted Bundy on charges of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary for the Chi Omega killings and assaults. He stood trial in June 1979 in the Florida Circuit Court for Dade County, with Judge Edward Cowart presiding. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defense. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and delusion. Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him, apparently, was that he be in charge. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of the defense team. A pre-trial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were amenable to a deal by one account because prospects of losing at trial were very good. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea bargain not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a tactical move. He could enter his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost, and for witnesses to die, move on, or retract their testimony. Once the case against him had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. It made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty, and he just couldn't do that. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members, Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the sorority house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving the house clutching the murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included impressions of the bite wounds Bundy had inflicted on Levy's left buttock, which forensic odontologists Richard Souviron and Lowell Levine matched to castings of Bundy's teeth. The jury was also allowed to hear details of Durange's previous kidnapping, and finally deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting Bundy on July 24th, 1979, of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Cowart imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. Bundy appealed his conviction and death sentence to the Supreme Court of Florida, but it affirmed them. 6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again after less than 8 hours of deliberation, due really to the testimony of eyewitnesses who saw him leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van. Important material evidence included clothing fibers with an unusual manufacturing error, and these were found in the van and on Leach's body, which matched fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the Leach trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law, providing that a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage. As he was questioning Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, she had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February 10th, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a third time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This third death sentence would be the one ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. Louise was the only one who begged for mercy. On October 24th, 1981, Boone gave birth to a daughter, Rose Bundy. While conjugal visits were not allowed at the Florida State Prison in Rainford, where Bundy was incarcerated, inmates were known to pool their money in order to bribe guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen McCaud and Hugh Ainsworth, speaking mostly in third person to avoid the stigma of confession. He began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and thought processes. Bundy recounted his career as a thief, confirming Klopfer's longtime suspicion that he had shoplifted virtually everything of substance that he owned. "The big payoff for me," he said, "was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and taken." Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault, he said, fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. At first, he killed his victims as a matter of expediency to eliminate the possibility of being caught, but later, murder became part of the adventure. The ultimate possession was in fact the taking of life, he said, and then the physical possession of the remains. Bundy would also confide in Special Agent William Hagmeyer of the FBI. Hagmeyer was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy took in murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one, and the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy told Hagmaier that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in his early years before moving into what he termed as his prime or predator phase at about the time of Healy's murder in '74. This implied he began killing well before 1974, although he never explicitly admitted having done so. In July of 1984, prison guards found 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Bundy's cell. A steel bar in one of the cell's windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror, and Bundy was moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with another high-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr. In October of '84, Bundy contacted Keppel and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in a serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway, which I have a video out about Gary in my True Crime ASMR series playlist, so go check it out. Keppel and Green River Task Force Detective Dave Reichert interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for a further 17 years. Keppel published a detailed documentation of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with McCod on another examination of the interview material. In early 1986, an execution date of March 4th was set on the Chi Omega convictions. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date, July 2nd, was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He told them that he revisited Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Smith's lifeless face and repeatedly washed Ames' hair. "If you've got time," he told Hagmaier, "they can be anything you want them to be." Bundy decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably before later found on Taylor Mountain, Raincourt, Parks, Ball, and Healy. He kept them in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2nd execution, the U.S. Court of Appeals stayed indefinitely and remanded the Chi Omega case back to the Southern District of Florida due to legal issues, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and an erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase, requiring the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty, which ultimately was never resolved. A new date, November 18th, was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November 17th. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling over the dissents of Justices Thurgood Marshall and William J. Brennan, Jr. Within hours of that final denial, a firm execution date of January 24th, 1989 was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeal courts had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics, though people everywhere seethed at the apparent delay in executing him. Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track. With all the appeal avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides, for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional, previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon, whom he declined to identify, if indeed he ever knew their identities. He said he left a 5th corpse, Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Klopfer's fireplace. He described the Issaquah crime scene where the bones of Ott, Naslund, and Hawkins were found, and it was almost like he was just there, like he was seeing everything. He was infatuated with the idea because he spent so much time there. He is just totally consumed with murder all the time. The investigators, all their impressions were similar. It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned them. His manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life's accomplishments. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to police. He explained that when he was in Utah, he could bring his victims back to his apartment where he could reenact scenarios depicted on the covers of detective magazines. A new ulterior strategy quickly became apparent. He withheld many details, hoping to parlay the incomplete information into yet another stay of execution. despite warnings from his appellant attorneys that the spectacle of peddling information for time would turn the courts against him. Bundy began offering investigators just pieces of information regarding some of his murders. There are other buried remains in Colorado, he admitted, but he refused to elaborate. The new strategy, immediately dubbed Ted Bones for Time scheme, served only to deepen the resolve of authorities to see Bundy executed on schedule and yielded little new information. In cases where he did give details, nothing was found. Colorado detective Matt Linvall interpreted this as a conflict between his desire to postpone his execution by getting more information and his need to remain in total possession, as Bundy was the only person who knew his victims' true resting places. When it became clear that no further stays would be coming from the courts, Bundy supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option, executive clemency. Diana Weiner, a young Florida attorney and Bundy's last love interest, there's so many, it's disgusting, asked the families of several Colorado and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal more information. All refused. And Diane Weiner, I hope you are rotting in hell right now. Could you imagine having a woman who in the press is known as a love interest of Ted Bundy coming to you and saying, you need to ask for the person who brutally killed your family. You need to ask for postponement of his execution because he might tell us where your family's remains are. She's disgusting. Anyway, the families already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them. They didn't need his confession. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to any further delays in any case. We are not going to have the system manipulated, he told reporters. For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. Boone had championed Bundy's innocence throughout all of his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was in fact guilty. She was back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone calls. She refused to accept his phone calls on the morning of his execution. She was hurt by his relationship with Diana Weiner and devastated by his sudden wholesale confessions in his last days. Hagmeyer was present during Bundy's final interviews with investigators on the eve of his execution. He talked of suicide. He did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die. Bundy rejected his last food and was executed in the Rayford electric chair at 7:16 a.m. on Tuesday, January 24th, 1989. His last words were directed at his attorney, Jim Coleman, and Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends. Hundreds of revelers sang, danced, and set off fireworks in a pasture across from the prison as the execution was carried out, then cheered as a white hearse containing Bundy's corpse departed the prison. He was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington State in accordance with his will. The night before his execution, Bundy confessed to 30 homicides, but the true total remains unknown, and Bundy occasionally made cryptic comments to encourage speculation. He told Ainsworth in 1980 that for every murder publicized, there could be one that was not. When FBI agents proposed a total tally of 36, Bundy responded, "Add one digit to that, and you'll have it." Years later, he told Nelson that the common estimate of 35 was accurate. But Keppel wrote that Ted and I both knew the total was much higher. In an interview, Keppel stated his belief that Bundy had killed at least 50 and maybe 75. John Henry Brown, a lawyer for Bundy, would later claim that the first person he killed was a young boy when they were playing some kind of sex game in the woods, and Bundy must have been only 12 or 13 or 14. Brown also said that Ted told him in that interview that he killed over 100 people. Brown would tell Bundy that they knew they now have the evidence to charge him with both cases. Leon County Sheriff Kenneth Katsarsis recalled, referring to the Chi Omega murders and the slaying of Leach. When Bundy was told they had the evidence, Bundy looked at him and said, "When you find the person that committed these crimes that you think I committed, that person is going to be wanted for murders of women in the 3 digits in 6 states." I don't think he knew how many he killed or why he killed them, said Reverend Fred Lawrence, and he was the Methodist clergyman who administered Bundy's last rites. On the evening before his execution, Bundy reviewed his victim tally with Hagmeyer on a state-by-state basis for a total of 30 homicides. In Washington, 11, including Parks, abducted in Oregon, but killed in Washington, and including 3 unidentified. In Utah, he killed 8 people with 3 unidentified. In Colorado, 3. In Florida, 3. In Oregon, 2, both unidentified. In Idaho, 2, 1 unidentified. And in California, 1 unidentified. So, that is the case of Ted Bundy. Now, this was a very, very long video, and I hope you enjoy it. This took me quite some time. I do plan on doing my best with placing pictures where they should be. 2 hours is a very long time. I just wanted to make sure to hit all of the information, hit this case in its entirety. Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers in America. He was a masochistic, disgusting man who I personally believe was dealing with hating his mother. I think it was her and his first girlfriend. I believe her name was Diane Edwards. I think he was just brought up with this hatred for women. I think also the backstory of his grandfather, who subbed in as his father. I think there's a lot there. I think sexual abuse may have occurred there. Because it's just, Bundy definitely came from a bad family. When they try and lessen that, I think that I don't want to do anything for this man, but that is definitely relevant. Because I think also there was something very clinically wrong with him. All these reports of him as a child doing bear traps, killing animals, just all of these things that we have proven to be signs of serial killers. People have compiled data, and a lot of this data comes from Bundy. A lot of this data has come from him. He kind of was the man that kind of set the staple for us to apply it to future serial killers. He was the first one that was really nationally televised. And it's just the fact that he went on this long. Again, we are thrown into this friggin' issue with this issue of territorialism. Back then, this was another, and I mean, this was in the 70s, so the 70s, I believe, the 70s and the 80s are prime time for serial killers in America. They went rampant. And it's just, this man was so sick and disgusting. In doing this case, I've watched many documentaries about him, and for some reason it never clicked to me that he was into necrophilia. I was unaware of all these things that he did to the bodies after, which, committing murder alone and in the ways that he did already is disgusting and despicable. But the fact that he continued to desecrate the remains even after, wherever this man is, he ain't having a good time. I do, however, think that being in prison would have been more of a punishment for him. Although I'm not mad that he was put down, he definitely deserved it, and it was definitely something that had to happen, and they definitely did not mess around with this man. I think also his ability to escape and make do with certain things. I mean, he was able to escape so many times right under their noses. I think it was also a very safety precaution, but honestly I would have put his ass in solitary confinement and let him rot there so he could think about his actions. I would have gotten a girl who had long brown hair that was middle parted, to sit and ask him questions and really just torment him as he tormented. He tormented women for so long. He just was definitely a menace to society, and I hope that his peers were awful to him. I mean, it seems that they weren't, because they were able to pool money so he could impregnate one of the many love interests. I also have a feeling that Bundy was fighting his issues with sexuality. That is a common thing that comes up in discussions about Bundy. This is during a time when being gay or even being curious about the same sex, that was something that just wasn't, you were really just, this is during a time when churches and the thoughts of the church and conservative thoughts really held true, and where he was brought up, I mean, his mother, when she was pregnant, she was brought to a home for unwed mothers. I think Bundy just grew up being this, he was a bastard child, which is already a sin in the eyes of the church. But I think he was just brought up being told and being made felt like he was just an abomination. And I think struggling with sexuality, I mean, the man had so many women, so many, and he was never satisfied. That's often a thing found in men struggling with sexuality, is that they can never get their fill of the opposite sex. They just can't fulfill those needs. And not fulfilling those needs, he went to murder and so on and so forth. And obviously the issues with his mother as well. That's just my thoughts. There's been many reports of him when he was younger. Like, for example, he was playing a sex game with a young boy and he murdered him. I think there's just a lot there. And his mother, Louise's own father, Samuel Caldwell, I think there's a lot of issues there as well. I think we find a lot of the time that the upbringing of these people who are brought up in homes where they are neglected, abused psychologically, and even physically, but it's really the psychological effects that really bring up these people being so hateful. They don't express empathy because they've never experienced it. I'm getting to the point where I really believe that empathy is something that is taught. If you were brought up in a household where everyone lacks empathy, how are you able to express empathy? You have no idea what it is. I just think we always go back to the childhood, and unfortunately, this childhood and upbringing of Bundy is really what, I'm not going to say that if those things didn't happen, he'd be a perfect little boy and live happily and have a white picket fence and be successful as a lawyer, but I do think that definitely influenced his rage. This was a very hateful man, and all these women who enabled him to think that he was so above everyone else. I have no sympathy for them. I really don't. He was manipulative, but all of these women were aware of these red flags. facts. They were aware of what kind of masochistic piece of shit he was. Klopfer, she's even calling the authorities, and she's still, come back home, honey. Like, and keeping him around her daughter, and then others are getting pregnant by him willingly. I hope Rose Bundy is doing well. I hope that and my mom, she grew up during this time, and personally, I have never thought that Ted Bundy was an attractive man. I don't understand the appeal, and I asked my mom because my mom was born in 55. This happened in 77, or the early 70s. So she was well of age during this time. So I asked her what her thoughts were. And she said that she never understood the appeal either. She said that he always gave her the creeps. Looking at this man, I don't understand how it went this long. He's so scary. His eyes, they look right through you. They're just so dark and menacing, and it bothers me. He was just so scary. And he was smart. Clearly, he was able to avoid law enforcement that long. He should have put his efforts into being a lawyer and being a good one. But thank God he didn't become a lawyer. Could you imagine? Now, there was a Netflix film released with Zac Efron, which I'm so sick of them putting these, like, heartthrobs as serial killers. Like they put Ross Lynch as Jeffrey Dahmer. They're putting Zac Efron as Ted Bundy. To me, that's just disgusting. You're sexualizing them because those men are sexualized every day that they're alive. That's what they're known for. And it's just like these movies are good, and these men did wonderful jobs portraying them. They did a great job acting. But why are you like, I guess for the name, to bring notoriety, I guess. I don't know. Like this romanticizing of serial killers, when the last thing a lot of these women were seeing, and men in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, were these monsters hovering over them and taking their lives because they have such little self-respect and appreciation for life. It just bothers me. So I think we have sat on this case long enough. I believe this video will be over 2 hours. It has taken me days I started this case, just a script and editing through information last week, and I've been recording it since Monday. It's been a while. And I hope that you are either asleep or are fully relaxed, and we have really went over every single aspect of this case from start to finish. As always, these videos are for awareness. I think it's important to go over these cases. It's important to bring these ladies and other victims' names up. Just because these last moments are just, it is so sad, and I just think it's important to remember how much of a piece of crap this man was. Because he thought he was amazing, and he was, in fact, shit. So, on that, I hope that you found this video relaxing, informative. I will be adding it to my True Crime ASMR series playlist. This is where you can find past and future videos in this series. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, spooky dreams. Thank you so much.